What do Kobe Bryant, Pope John Paul II, and Alex Rodriguez all have in common? And what was this magical treatment that so many sports stars seem to be flocking to Germany to have done? Well, in today's video, we're going to take a look at this supposed Kobe treatment and what exactly was being injected into these players' joints and the theory behind why they were doing it. What's going on, everybody? My name is Brian, and for those new to the page, I'm a doctor and a sports fan, and it's my goal in these videos to combine those two interests to explain different sports injuries and sports medicine topics in a way that hopefully you can understand and learn from. Now, the story went something like this. A player such as Kobe would be having pain in his knee that was thought to be secondary to arthritis. Because these procedures weren't FDA approved in the US, they would fly over to Germany where it was actually developed and was approved, have this blood drawn out of their arm, have it kind of adjusted, spun down, messed with in a lab, injected back into the joint, and then they would return to the US for their playing season. So first off, what was this product? What were they injecting, and what really was it called? The actual product itself is something called orthokine or regenikine, depending on the generation, and is a type of autologous conditioned serum. Autologous meaning it's from your own body, conditioned meaning you've done something to it to change its makeup or consistency, and then serum meaning components of the blood. In short, what they were doing was drawing blood from a person, doing some sort of process or procedure to it to modify it, and then injecting it back in. We know there's a lot of different things that athletes and non-athletes alike are doing in terms of joint injections for things like arthritis. We all, of course, have heard about steroid injections. Those are probably the most common and well studied. And now there's more newer things they're looking at like PRP, stem cell therapy, and more stuff like this conditioned serum that we're going to talk about today. Let's break down the science, and don't worry, this is going to be nice and simple so that you can understand what exactly was different about the procedure that players like Kobe were having done. We've got to take a step back and look first of all at what is in the blood, what makes up our blood. And there's three big categories we're going to break down. The first is our red blood cells, and we all of course know what those are. Those are the cells carrying oxygen and nutrients through our body. And those actually make up somewhere around like 35-45% of our blood. Next we have our white blood cells, and those are the cells that help fight infection. They're the cells that make antibodies, they're the cells that go eat up the bacteria, and those are much fewer. Only around 1% of all of our blood are those white blood cells. And then the rest of the stuff in our blood are things like platelets that are involved in blood clotting, proteins, nutrients, electrolytes, water, everything else that makes up the blood. Now, this specific procedure that Kobe and other athletes were having done specifically looked at the white blood cells. Whenever a body has some sort of infection, the white blood cells are the ones really in charge. They're producing all these different chemicals that are involved in fighting off the infection. Now, there are literally dozens of these. We're not going to go into the name of all of them and why they're particularly important, except for one that does matter in this injection. All you need to know is the name of it. It was called IL-1 or interleukin-1, but just remember IL-1 as the key kind of chemical that these white blood cells were making. Now, the theory of why this would matter in someone with knee arthritis is osteoarthritis is in general a condition where we have breakdown of the cartilage around the bone, and there can be inflammation, there can be damage to that lining of the bone. It's actually a really, really complex process that we don't fully understand, but we know that there is a lot of pain, we know that there's stiffness, and we know that these inflammatory markers play some sort of role in the whole disease process. So when we talk about things like steroid injections, we're saying, okay, how can we decrease the inflammation, because steroids decrease inflammation. So theoretically, if we can decrease inflammation, maybe we can decrease the pain and help that athlete be able to play without having severe pain. Now, these products like regenikine and orthokine were also trying to target inflammation, but in a different way. What they said was, let's use these different chemicals that the body produces that affect inflammation, and let's try to block them. Let's try to prevent them from working to decrease the inflammation. So what they do, making this blood product that they inject, is they first go and they draw out blood from that own athlete. They then let that blood sit at a certain temperature, and it's within a bunch of little glass beads, little tiny glass spheres. And what those do is those stimulate those white blood cells to produce all these different chemicals that affect inflammation. But in particular, what they're trying to produce is one that blocks the action of that IL-1 chemical. So the hope is now you've collected this blood and you've got this abundance of compound that blocks the action of a different chemical that we think is causing part of the pain with arthritis. You then go back and you inject that blood back into the knee, And theoretically, you've got a bunch of this chemical around that blocks the other bad chemical, and so it doesn't work and you don't get as much pain and swelling. So the big question, does this work? In theory, it sounds like, yeah, it would work really, really well. Part of the problem is it's really, really, really expensive, and it's not considered here in the US to be any sort of indication for treatment of osteoarthritis. And so here in the US, there's a lot of limitations about doing it, about providing that service. I think there are some places that are starting to do it in the US where you just private pay for it, but it's not anything that insurance companies are going to approve, and so we don't really have that much good research about it. There are two big studies that have looked at this. One of the studies was actually done over in Germany and compared this regenikine, this ACS, to that hyaluronic acid, or that kind of lubricating material. And when it compared those two against each other, they found that the people who were given that regenikine, this new one we're talking about, had better symptoms. They had less pain. There was also another study that compared this conditioned serum, the regenikine, to just injecting saline or injecting water. And again, they found that, of course, in that case, the people who got this special injection had less pain. There's a lot of different little nuances in the studies that make them hard to relate to everybody. For example, a lot of the patients only had very mild osteoarthritis. So these aren't people like your 70 or 80-year-old grandpa that's got like bone-on-bone disease. These are people like your athletes who have very, very mild arthritis that get these injections and do pretty well. So there's some limitations. We definitely need to do more research on it. We need to try to refine a better standardized process for producing it. But is it reasonable to think that someday down the road that this might be a very common thing that people are getting, like you and me, when we have arthritis? Potentially. I think there's a lot of theoretical benefit to it, and some studies have already shown great results. Next time you hear about any of these athletes going to Germany for these magical kind of secret treatments, now you can hopefully understand the basic science behind what's going on. Again, it's all about trying to decrease and block inflammation. These newer procedures like this regenikine, what they're doing is just targeting it in a very different and unique way. I'm sure there'll be a lot more research on this in the future, and we're gonna have all kinds of other different injections. PRP is already becoming a really big thing that we'll probably talk about in a future video. But it's interesting to see where all this is going, because it's definitely gonna change the way that athletes and non-athletes get treated for things like arthritis. That's it for this video, everybody. Thank you as always for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.